Hi, everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful week. Just saying hi from snowy and cold New York, where I'm spending a few weeks. So, after I gave my presentation on the case for optimism, which really featured solar, a number of people and experts wanted me to dive deeper on how are things going. Solar, is solar really going to be the end-all, be-all solution for problems in the climate change race? And as luck would have it, a friend of mine of many, many years who's been an expert in the solar space reached out, and we were talking about it. He was talking about helping me actually bring my house in Turks and Caicos off grid and like make it solar, add batteries, and realize he's the perfect person to discuss this. So I decided to invite him. And so, with that little intro, let's get going for the week. So welcome to Playing with Unicorns, episode 17, The State of Solar. So, Kareem, thank you for joining me and joining all of us this week.
Happy to be here. Thank you, Fabrice, for this opportunity.
So you've been in the solar space for many, many years. Why don't you give us a little bit of your background before we dive into today's topic, which is the state of solar?
Okay. So for that, let me just dive into the presentation and then we'll make a conversation out of it.
Perfect.
So this is a presentation really for entrepreneurs, investors, as well as contractors and property owners, and I'll get into the why of that. But first, I guess, let me give a little bit of background of me so the audience knows, where I'm coming from, what kind of experiences have shaped me, because I'm going to be sounding very bullish on solar and, this saying, to a hammer, everything is a nail. And just kind of, for people to know what kind of a hammer I am, I wanted to put this slide to share my background. Kind of like you, I grew outside of the US in Istanbul, Turkey, came to the US for college, mostly worked for software and technology companies for the first decade of my life. Along the way, I got an engineering degree, an MBA, did a little bit of management consulting. Once I got my green card, I became an entrepreneur. My first startup was an internet company, kind of like yours. I was in the internet space for a good seven or so years. I built one of the earlier social networks, which became literally the most trafficked Turkish website, ran from San Francisco, ironically. After that, I got into solar, and for almost a decade, we built and ran Civic Solar with my co-founders and our team. Civic Solar was one of the leading web-enabled equipment distribution platforms for the U.S., mostly the U.S. market. We served a little bit outside of the U.S. into Latin America, Caribbean, and even some other markets. But, our customers were mostly contractors. And then, and now I'm starting this.
Well, maybe talk about give a sense of scale, because if I'm not mistaken, you grew Civic Solar to over 60 million in revenues, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm going to get into that in just a little bit. One other thing that I want to share with the audience is between every startup or every shift in my direction from corporate world to startups, and from internet to solar, and from solar to maybe the knowledge space, I generally took about a year off to kind of see the major trends and what is happening in the world, what are some waves that I noticed to ride on. And so just quick background, what I'm noticing, and as most of us in the internet and technology space know, information wants to be free. So both of my startups essentially took advantage of that wave, that information wants to be free. Yonca, when I started Yonca, which was a social network, online dating sites were a thing, and it was a pretty established industry. The one extra layer of information transparency that social networks brought were the relationships between profiles, for instance, and that was a really major change. It was a small change, but it had a huge impact. And when we started Civic Solar, there were a number of solar equipment distributors in the U.S. which operated with very old brick and mortar business models. What we brought as Civic Solar was a web layer, kind of e-commerce married on top of distribution. And so a little bit of background about Civic Solar. We essentially were a web-enabled inventory-less or minimal inventory distribution company. We started with less than $500,000 of capital. We didn't even use 150,000 of it to get to profitability, and we grew the company organically to over $60 million in 6 years. We were recognized as the fastest growing private companies by Inc. 3 years in a row. And ultimately, we were acquired by CD Greentech, which is the leader in our category.
And just so I understand, your customers were the contractors?
Mostly contractors. We had a small bit of DIY as well.
Okay.
But where we really excelled was hand-holding the contractors, many of which were electrical contractors, as well as HVAC and other types of contractors. And we would handhold them through their projects in the first, 2, 3, 4, 5 projects, just to essentially share deep product and technical knowledge with them to get them confident in installing solar. The one thing that most people don't know is that every single electrician, if you're an electrical contractor, you're already qualified to be a solar contractor. You have the hardest skills to gain already as an electrician. The rest is it's kind of like, teaching a coder how to code in a new language, right? And so, we would essentially help with that, and that's how the company grew. And then ultimately, it was acquired by a great player in the industry. And with Solar Academy, what I'm hoping to do, and this is really early, and we're in the very, very early stages of our journey, is to empower solar professionals early in their solar entrepreneurship journey by connecting knowledge, people, and capital, and accelerating the transition to solar plus storage for building owners. The one thing that the world is going to go through, hopefully in the next decade or two, is that hundreds of millions of buildings and millions of contractors will get familiar with the solar asset, as I call it. And this asset is a pretty amazing asset. And, my view is, and I think many industry insiders think the same way, and even political leaders, most of our power generation is going to be done with renewables, and a big portion of that is going to be solar. And every building could have solar plus battery, essentially, on them or in them or next to them. And that will be a huge wave of green economy change coming our way.
But what's interesting is when you talk to people and you ask them, hey, or you tell them, so I've made this argument so many times before, like solar is now the cheapest form of energy production. It keeps getting cheaper. The returns are amazing. Yet most people in the general public, I would say, are skeptical. They'll say, yeah, but it may grow very quickly, but it's like a whatever tiny percentage of overall electricity production. I think perhaps they don't understand the impact of like exponential change, and so it's maybe a math problem more than anything else. But most people express really fundamental skepticism.
Yeah, I think most people miss exponential lines in or exponential graphs, and that was the same. Like when I first noticed Friendster, which was my inspiration for Yonca, and I noticed their exponential growth, like 2% a day. I was like, oh my God, this is going to be big. And like, we got to do this for the rest of the world besides just the US. And that was my inspiration with the social network at the time. People who loved me were like, what are you doing leaving your great job, the corporate world, for this crazy thing? And I was like, I think it's going to be big. And the same, like a decade ago or more than a decade ago, when I was looking into solar, people like Ray Kurzweil and, I hadn't heard of Tony Seba, who I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But, all these futurists, they were talking about how solar was already exponentially growing back then. And I'm going to share a few slides on that in a little bit. But first, let me share. These exponential phenomena are a thing. And I think if you watch them carefully, if you understand the details around them, they're great opportunities to build businesses around. And I'm going to get into that. But first, I want to share a little bit about the history of solar. Solar power has been used for thousands of years. Back in 6000 BC in China, they would design the homes in a specific way to maximize sun's power to heat the homes. The photovoltaic effect, which essentially enabled this industry, was discovered in the late 1800s. Einstein received a Nobel Prize for it in the early 1900s. The first commercialization really happened in the 50s. And then, big oil companies got in it and then out of it. It became a thing with hippies. I actually did just like you, I interviewed some solar players in the industry on my platform, Solar Academy, and we did a great session with Go Green Solar and Planet Plansets, two leading companies that have been in the industry for many, many years. And there, Deep Patel, founder of Go Green Solar, goes into the detail of this history. For many, there's a good 10 to 20 minute segment that talks about this history in detail. And of course, there's been policies in Europe and in the US that advance solar. And, today California has already 1 million homes with solar, which is probably about half the US inventory, and growing very, very rapidly. So that exponential phenomena that we were talking about, what's been driving that is essentially the decrease in cost of solar panels. But solar panels is not the only equipment that goes into a solar system. We need to also understand that. But traditionally, and still is, it's been, probably half the equipment cost, or maybe a bit less now. But, look at that orange graph there. The cost has come down dramatically in the past several decades. And as the costs have come down, the industry has grown exponentially as well. Here's another.
So this is a decrease of what divided by 120. It looks like over 40 years.
Or in this case, which is a slightly different years, but about the same last 40 years or so. 200 times.
200x, yeah, that's really impressive. I think the reason people don't notice it, by the way, is because it's kind of a slow Moore's law. It's just Moore's law is like you're doubling every 18 months, and here it's like decreasing, I think 15% per year is by the right number in terms of compounding.
That's about right.
Yeah, and the thing is, people, when it's 2x, they notice it. When it's 15%, it takes a while before they actually notice it.
That's right, yeah. And it's a physical industry too. It's not, bikes. It's not a digital economy. It's a physical economy. So putting panels on the ground is still slow compared to Clubhouse becoming popular in a few weeks, right? So, and the graph on the right shows the exponential growth worldwide. And the funny thing is, when I looked at this graph back in 2009, it had the same exponential curve going back at another 10 years.
Yeah, just a much smaller base, and so it looked tiny relative to the other energy production.
Exactly. And, Ray Kurzweil has a good saying, when you reach 1%, you're halfway in an exponential growth. So, and we are at 2% now in the US and even more in some other parts of the world. And I'll talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so some of the audience are actually asking about solar microgrids, which is great because that's kind of the direction you were going to be talking about, and also what the status of storage is. No, exactly. Well, we should talk about, when we get there in the presentation, we're going to touch all these things.
And again, if you look at, what made me a believer in solar, versus wind or geothermal or other things was, that these exponential curves were much stronger for solar back, a decade ago, but also the amount of energy in sun is way more, and we'll get into that. And Andrew Beebe, who and I know, he's a great venture capitalist, penned a great article about this just about a week ago, where the cost of solar has come down, almost 90% in the past decade, and it was the same case the decade before that, and it might very well be the case this decade too, and that will change things in a really dramatic way.
Yeah, I mean, what I like about this relative to others is that not only is it the cheapest, but it continues to get cheaper. And that's not true of the other forms of energy. They actually have a tendency to become more expensive as time goes on, and they become more scarce.
Right. So, I mean, it already is an asset. One of my mentors who have a background both in real estate and solar says, solar assets are kind of very similar to real estate assets. The only, when you build a solar system or solar farm, the process of building that business is pretty much the same as a real estate developer's process. You build an asset that brings an income, and the thing is that the cost of that asset is coming down at 15% per year, and the output of that asset is increasing at is steady for, sun shines the same every year, and the cost of electricity traditionally has been going up 3-4% every year, and we can talk about why that is also. But so the cost is going down 15%. The output is valued 3-4% more every year. So that's an asset whose output is improving 20% per year, and that's been happening for the past decades, and will likely continue to happen.
That's why I'm saying, like, even without subsidies and intervention, et cetera, it'll happen just because once it becomes economically viable and cheaper than all the other alternatives, this is what people invest in. And so, obviously, it's better, or if you have a carbon pricing.
Well, it already is. It's cheaper than
but that's not true. That's not true. It's true in production. It's not true when you include storage. And
exactly.
We're going to get there, but
yeah, we'll get there. But looking at it from an environmental perspective too, so this is a recent graph for greenhouse gas emissions by economic sector in the U.S., which is pretty similar in the world too. Most of the cause of greenhouse gas emissions is transportation and electricity and commercial and residential buildings, and we have the means to change all of this to renewable sources, mostly I think solar and batteries, in the next decade, and I think it's gonna happen. And then there's gonna be a little bit of agriculture and a little bit of industry left over, and I'm sure there are some people thinking about.
Well, actually, the industry side is being addressed as well. I mean, companies like Heliogen can create enough heat that you can actually make steel or cement without greenhouse gas emissions. So solar, I think, will even play a role there. In agriculture, there are other trends happening, like lab-grown meat and plant-based, stuff like that. So I'm actually optimistic across all of these. The numbers are actually globally rather different. Transportation is only 14%, and agriculture is more 25% on a global level. But regardless, the lessons are the same.
Right. But of course, us here in the U.S. are the bigger polluters. But anyway, so here's another high-level view of the energy landscape in the U.S. What you're seeing here are the sources and uses of energy, and this is a graph from 2019. I'll go back to 2009 for a second, and here, if you look at this, you'll notice that natural gas, coal, and petroleum are majority of the sources, and then solar is tiny, and so are the other types of sources. But have a look at coal, which is 19%, almost 20% back in 2009, has become only 11% a decade later, and that's a good trend. And natural gas has grown tremendously, and everyone has been saying that natural gas is the bridge to clean energy, and I think that's been true and will likely stay so for another decade or two. But after that, who knows? But what is also amazing about this graph is the amount of rejected energy here on the right, which is all the energy that is lost because of, in the case of petroleum, mostly because of internal combustion engines have a huge loss of energy in the form of heat and friction and other things. And same in electricity production, a lot of it is lost in the process. What solar has the potential to do is, produce and consume at the same location. Obviously, that requires batteries to get cheaper, and we're going to talk a little bit about that now too. But when it comes to these, like predicting the future of the solar market and the batteries, my go-to person is Tony Seba, and on YouTube you can find a lot of his talks, and he really talks in detail about all this, disruptive trends in the world. And he goes back to 1900s, how the St. Patrick's Day parade was done with horses, and 13 years later there was only one horse in the whole parade. When it was one car in 1900s, it became one horse in 1913. And he talks about how companies like McKinsey were asked in the 80s to predict the future of, like in the Gordon Gekko times, like what will be the future of cell phones, and they predicted less than 1 million would be in circulation by year 2000. And they were off by a factor of 100x or 109x. And he talks about how, all these major industry sources or associations always predict the growth linearly as opposed to exponentially. And he says he doesn't understand why, and I don't understand why either. But that's been the case. And the one thing that Tony says is that, the cost of batteries are coming down, just like panels, at exponential rates. And we will very soon reach a point where we're going to be not in grid parity, but he calls it God parity, which is essentially when solar plus battery locally produced electricity is going to be cheaper than even the cost of maintaining the grid. And that will be a game changer.
So let's talk about both those things briefly. So first of all, lithium-ion battery costs, I think, went down 85% in the last decade. Do we think that that's going to continue for the coming decade? At what point do we get to this God parity, in your opinion, and perhaps in Tony's opinion?
Yeah, I think, that's pretty much the trend, and I think it will continue, and I think it's going to happen in 5 to 10 years.
So in the U.S., obviously electricity prices are all over the place, but like, what's the average kilowatt hour pricing in the U.S. right now? Like 11 cents?
It's about 13 cents. It's been 12 cents forever, and it's come to 13 cents. And I do have a slide on that coming up.
But right now, today, just by comparison's sake, if I buy solar, batteries and a solar panel, what am I at? Like how how, just so I understand how much decrease we need to get to make a microgrid viable.
It really depends. So far about 2% of homes in the U.S. have gone solar, and much of those homes are paying higher rates than the average, which is 13 cents. And I do have a slide, and maybe I should jump to that because it would be helpful to understand the economics of a home solar system.
Okay.
Right? So this is, the average home consumes about 10,000 kilowatt hours of electricity at 13 cents per kilowatt hour, pays about $1,300 in the U.S.
That's per what? Per year?
That's the average home. Like if you are in California or the Northeast states, the cost of electricity is way higher in those locations. And if you're, right next to a hydro, power plant, or next immediately next to a nuclear power plant, your cost could be 6 cents. Or if you're in Hawaii or in an island like Turks and Caicos, your cost could be 40 cents or 50 or 60 cents. So the value of that electricity ranges in a big way. And most of the solar goers today are paying, I would say, double.
Okay.
So this math, which assumes a 10-year payback without batteries, by the way, is for the average home. But if you are most of the 2 million homes that have gone solar, you're probably getting a 20% year or a 5-year payback on a typical size solar system paid at, typical U.S.
Yeah, and that's
and
improving by
cost,
15% a year. Now, the reason you don't need batteries, by the way, and I clarifying that for the audience, is in the U.S. you can sell your electricity to the grid, and the grid can be your battery, and so you don't need the batteries. But in a place like Turks and Caicos, where Karim and I were thinking of how do I bring my house off grid, where even though electricity is 40 or 50 cents there, where maybe a bit cheaper right now, it's 35, but often 40 or 50 cents. I need batteries because the grid will not accept the electricity, and so that of course increases my setup cost pretty dramatically. But given the electricity is so much more expensive, we can still make it work in 5 to 10 year payback, and of course that's declining 15% a year. So the payback period is decreasing to the point that microgrids are going to definitely become viable, and they're already very viable in places like Indonesia or Malaysia. Many companies, or actually where electricity is super expensive, or building their own microgrids because it's cheaper and frankly also more reliable. I mean, the issue is often the grid in many of these developing countries is not reliable at all.
Exactly. Right on. All right, so let me keep going. So this is essentially how much power we get from the sun. And, somebody said to me, well, every major source of power that we use, or fossil fuels or whatever else, is essentially a derivative of the solar power, and it probably is true. But anyway, we do get more than 1,000 times more power on the surface of the Earth than we are using as humanity today, and assuming a third of the surface is land, and only we've develop 1% of it as humans in real estate and roads and other structures. Even if we did capture that 1% piece, we would have more power with solar than we are using today. And another interesting fact is that the amount of sunshine that falls on Texas in 1 month contains more energy than all of the oil that has ever been pumped in the state of Texas. And another couple interesting facts, a square area of 90 miles by 90 miles is enough to provide, with solar panels, is enough to provide all of the electricity in the U.S., and about the same for Europe, and slightly bigger for the world. And again, it's that 1% number, which is about 1% of the land mass has been developed by humans. If we could just put solar and batteries on all of those buildings, I think we solve a huge part of the problem.
In fact, I don't think it's going to happen this way, meaning it's not going to be a massive installation in the Sahara and then we're going to send electricity everywhere in the world. I think it's going to be those microgrids that Mathieu was talking about, where people are going to have their own, everyone's going to have solar panels and batteries, and that will be the path, as opposed to very concentrated, massive solar farms.
I agree. And yet I think they will be interconnected. Utility companies will still continue to exist, and there will be a role for them, but there will be distributed power, and it'll be connected, and it'll be a mix. I agree. Yeah. And there will still be some large solar farms and solar assets, yet with hundreds of millions of assets. So we talked about the decrease of costs. A decade ago, when I entered the industry back around 2010, an average panel cost about $750. Today it's more like $150. And this is an average panel that goes on a home in the US. It could be a bit less, it could be a bit more, depending on its features. But this cost drop will likely continue. Even if it goes down to 50 and 30 in the next couple of decades, that's going to make this solar asset an incredible asset class, probably much better than the traditional asset classes as we know it, maybe with the exception of tech companies these days. But
yeah, but actually, what's interesting is this is also part of the problem. I mean, because prices keep falling, people have an incentive to break the long-term contracts. Like people were telling me like a decade ago, solar's like bonds, right? You buy it up front, like you install the capacity, and then you just get paid every year based on the contracts that you sign, and they pay you blah kilowatt per hour. The issue is because it keeps getting cheaper and cheaper, those people that sign 20 or 30-year contracts have a very strong incentive to break those contracts as they can, and makes them unviable. I mean, the same way the subsidies.
Yeah, I mean, that is true. That is true, and that's a potential risk for, companies that lease solar panels and their business model is based on them. And that's definitely a risk. But those companies, an argument on their side is they own the customer relationship, so they can maybe put some solar assets and manage the consumers' energy remotely. There could be some benefits there, and usually those types of companies are close with the utilities. And we're still going to need utilities, so they can play that role too. And most people, to be honest, they don't put in the effort to optimize their few $1,000 energy expense.
Yeah, no, I wasn't worried for the Tesla solar installations. I was more worried for people selling to governments. Like government of whatever, Spain or Germany signs a massive contract. They agree to pay 13 cents per kilowatt hour, and the problem is and they signed a 30-year contract, and then a decade later they realize that if they can sign a new contract at 2 cents, they often have a tendency to do that and bankrupt the original companies, and so that has not been ideal.
That's a trend, and depending on the government, those contracts don't always last their lifetime, but that's definitely been the case in the industry. But so just to talk about the economics of a single panel, and this is, again, average electricity price, less than average sun. I assumed only 4 hours per day of sun, and higher than average price solar panel probably, or per watt price for a panel. You're getting close to 40% yield on this panel. And so imagine if the cost of this panel goes down by a third, your yield is going to go up 3 times.
And to be clear, that's only the panel cost, right? Like you're not including labor, etc. Okay, we're going to go through that.
And again, so now let's talk about like a typical home in the U.S., which is about 4 times the cost of the panel. And the reason that is because there's inverter, racking equipment, and other balance of systems, and then there's a whole bunch of labor, which multiplies the cost by 4 times in the U.S. And I'll come there. But when the cost goes up, and that's U.S. and in other parts of the world, that cost doesn't go up 4 times. It goes up maybe 2 times or 3 times, depending. And we'll talk a little bit about the dynamics of the U.S. market and maybe others too. But also one other thing to understand when understanding the economics of a solar asset is the solar resource. California and Hawaii are some of the most deeply penetrated states in the U.S. when it comes to solar, and most people think, that must be because of the sun. But it really isn't, because no matter where you go in the U.S., whether you're in Seattle or Maine, or you're in San Diego like me, or Miami, the solar resource varies only plus or minus 20%. Well, another cool thing about the solar is it's pretty consistent from year to year, unlike wind, which kind of is another reason why solar, I think, is a better asset from a financing perspective. But that solar resource variance is 20%, no matter, in most places where people live in the world. Whereas the cost of that electricity, as we talked about a little earlier, is, can vary 10 times. It can be as cheap as 5-6 cents or as high as 50 to 60 cents. So that changes that ROI formula in a major way. So the reason why California is so highly penetrated in Hawaii is because electricity starts at around 20 cents in California as opposed to 13 cents and goes all the way into the 40s. And same with Hawaii. It's, Hawaii is even higher.
And also the fact that the grid doesn't seem very reliable in California. I think a lot of people probably want batteries as well and backup these days because it seems that it's becoming less reliable by the day.
That's another problem. That's the curse of too big not to fail. I call that not too big to fail, but too big not to fail. Getting back to the economics of a single home. So this is this home, an average home, 10,000 kilowatt hours per year is the consumption at 13 cents, $1,300. But again, at 50 cents, that's $5,000, or at 6 cents, that could be as low as $600. And the thing is, until recently, most of these homes were powered with coal. And you need to burn about 1 pound of coal to make 1 kilowatt hour of electricity, which is 10,000 pounds a year, or 300,000 pounds over 30 years at a cost of $60,000, or and causing all sorts of pollution and fumes. Or you can go solar. Today, with today's prices, an average system would cost about 13 grand after tax credits in the U.S. market. It's pretty much a no-brainer at this point for most homes to go solar, even at the average prices. Which will get you a 10-year payback. It's not great, but it's not bad either. Of course, one thing here to understand here is that net metering policy. This is the contract that homes do with the utilities, where utilities agree to buy that power at the retail rate. And the net metering policies have gone through many different versions. In the markets like California and other markets, and some markets are adopting these just recently. But this becomes a key piece of policy for solar to advance, and there are some challenges here. To talk on the side of the utilities, they also have a lot of constraints to operate within, because when you have too much solar power on the grid, then you get this duck curve, which is essentially, during the day hours, you have a lot of power coming from the solar systems into the grid, which, decreases the need for other types of sources. But at some point, it starts imbalancing the grid, causing frequency issues, demand response issues, so you need to balance the grid. And for that, you either need batteries or you got to stop putting more solar. So having 10% penetration or so, I would say 10 to 20% is the max I think most utility companies are comfortable with, without batteries on the grid edge. But now a lot of batteries are being put in California too. I think in the Bay Area it's close to 50% now for some companies, or more in certain others. And
the batteries are put in by the individuals, or the batteries are being put in by companies, or by the grid itself? Or all?
Generally, they're being put by the companies and owned by, the major companies that have a business model of owning and leasing, and owning the asset and leasing it to the homeowners. Where in those cases, the homeowners are generally not optimizing their return and are just putting it for maybe 10-20% cost savings, but not getting the full 50%, for instance. In those cases, it's the companies that own them. But there are also many other I guess more technically curious customers that do put the batteries themselves as well.
Okay.
And what's going to happen over the next few years is we're going to go from 1 million or 2 million homes being grid connected to 5, 10, maybe.
Yeah, but that to your point, that creates a problem on grid balancing. At some point, they can't do it.
Right. Well, and those are where the opportunities are, because, I call that, industry calls that the grid edge, and there's going to be a ton of opportunities at the grid edge with microgrids and batteries, because, and we'll see it. We'll see how that evolves, but I think in certain cases, people will own their own power and they'll manage it. In some other cases, they're going to say, you know what, I want a third-party company to manage this, or I trust my utility company to do this. I think it's going to be different from region to region and, around the world. And this is the cost of the batteries as Tony Seba. And, and that really does change the...
But is that a 2014 projection? Is it on track? Or is that updated?
This seems. I think this is a recent 2020 projection by him, and that 2020 number of $170 per kilowatt hour
is actual. Okay,
is a recent number, and
look, if it goes to 170
that will go
to
down.
100 in 3 years, that'd be pretty impressive.
Right, and then if it goes to like 40 in another 7 years.
Yeah, because then I assume that's buying it, and then you're using it for a certain number of years. I don't know if it's 10 years or 20 years, right. So that makes it...
Yeah, most batteries do run for 10 years.
10 years.
Yeah, or more. Yeah. I just encourage people to watch Tony's talks, and he talks about how great the economics of a Tesla car is compared to all others, and it's absolutely true. And,
So a lot of people are also complaining and saying, hey, when you build solar, it has a lot of greenhouse gases in the manufacturing of the solar panels, et cetera. Have you looked at the math of how negative or bad it is?
I did. I should have. I don't have good detailed data on that. I haven't. I have, and I've heard positive things. It's generally like to the order of 10 to 20 times better than burning all that coal.
Okay.
But I don't have a good source that I can cite right now.
Okay, no problem.
Something to look into for sure. This hammer hasn't looked at that part of the nail. So interesting facts. About a decade ago, less than 100,000 homes had solar systems in the U.S. and today, of the 128 million U.S. homes, more than 2 million have solar. So that's a 20x growth on the resi sector, 2% penetration. And in places like Hawaii, more than 30% of homes have solar, and in California, 11% or more. This is growing at 20-25% a year. And I think we'll continue to do so. Probably will get faster with all the new policies that are coming from the new administration.
So when will the majority of electricity be produced by solar in the U.S.?
I think it's going to be in 5 to 10 years.
That quickly?
Well, probably closer to 10 than 5.
Okay. Yeah. And today it's what?
But
it's 2%, 1%, not even.
Well, right now we're about 2%.
2% electricity made by solar. Okay, so we need to...
Yeah, that's in the U.S. But in Australia, you already have 25% of all homes have gone solar. They have 9 million households, 2 million have solar.
And what does that look like in terms of like the energy production per year? Like what percentage is from solar, or you don't know?
I don't know. Like for the whole economy, I don't know, but it's probably less than 25%. Because the industry probably hasn't transitioned at the same rate yet. But I think this cost is going to go down. And the other amazing thing is the average resi system in Australia costs 70 cents, according to Green Tech Media, which is less than which is about a quarter of what the U.S. average resi.
Do you know why?
Cost.
Like, do they just consume less, or is labor cost lower? Is it like
the answer to that? The answer to that is this picture. Because you have hundreds of different utility companies with different policies and rate structures. And like in the US, the power infrastructure and the energy industry is highly fragmented. There's not a single government monopoly company or, generally government associated monopoly that provides that power. Because in the US, we like checks and balances, distributed power, not giving one major power to a few players, or one player especially. So, and that's just the nature of the U.S. culture and the way the energy economy industry has evolved. So, and every company has their own pace at which they evolve. Whereas in a place like Australia, and also Germany was the same in the early days of solar there, there was one way to finance solar, one way to market it. You got a mailer from the energy company, and one way to install it. And, it just was very efficient. And so you can really make things almost fascist efficient that way. Or you can have the distributed model that US has and let things happen more organically. And that's really the reason why we have 10 times less penetration in the US than Australia, I think. I don't know if other people have other opinions on this. I'd love to hear. I mean, this is the way I see it. But so some other things I want to talk about is as I've taken off like most of last year, and COVID has been a time of hunkering down and reflection for most people, I think, or hunkering down for most people. For me, I was lucky enough to take the year off to reflect. I see a lot of major trends, and this is a graphic that I've seen on Bill Tye's Facebook posts probably a couple years ago. But I think this major mindset shifts are happening or have been happening, and I think the COVID situation is accelerating that. And I think out of this period, there will be some good changes that come to the world, where people think a little bit more instead of just profit-minded, optimizing for numbers, to a little bit more purpose-focused businesses. Traditional top-down hierarchies will probably be more network-like hierarchy, structures going forward. Controlling culture to empowering culture, from planning to experimentation. In the startup world, we see that all the time, and from privacy to transparency. And I think this is going to apply to major parts of our lives, from power and energy and politics to education, even spirituality and religion, and health and finance. And I just sense these changes are coming, and I'm happy to...
So I agree with both of these. The one I push back on is I like purpose, but I like purpose connected to profit. Not because I think profit is inherently valuable, but because I think you need to be able to calculate the ROI in what you're doing. I don't think if you're doing non-for-profit and you have no metrics to... the cost of saving a life could be 50 cents or it could be 10 million. And if you don't measure it, it has a huge impact. Right. And so I think the two... I think profit connected to purpose, I think is or purpose connected to profit, I think is valuable because it leads to scalable systems. Pure purpose, and I could decide, and I'm probably going to get criticized for this, but I don't know, you create to help people recover through art, and then I create an art museum, and I'm is that really the best allocation of resources to help people deal with challenges? I'm not so sure. And
well, I agree. I think it depends on your level of wealth too. I think if you have billions and billions, you might want, making an art museum is not a big percentage of your wealth, and that could be something good for the world. But if you're a smaller time entrepreneur or investor, then I think it's both. I think the answer is both. I think purpose is gonna get a bigger share in that, because I feel like lately, maybe it was always there, but it feels like
I don't know. Maybe it's not there in the big companies, or what is a large enterprise's purpose? But at the very beginning, when you're creating a startup, it's all mission driven. It's not like, oh, let's make a bunch of money, right? Like, I think it's like people want, they see a broken user experience and they want to improve it. They see a business model that's not generous to consumers and they want to improve it. And I don't know, I think that especially startups are mission driven. And maybe at some point they become so big that they lose that sense of mission. I think often companies, when they become large, become the antithesis of what they originally stood for. And there's that kind of irony that happens to all larger institutions. But I think a lot of people are mission driven. And I think that's the beauty of living in 2021. Like, you can actually be mission driven and actually find a way to make money, right? Like, the passion economy is becoming a thing. And so I like that finally you can be purposeful and have a business model.
I agree. I think most startups, like you said, are driven by a purpose, and that's why they get started. And along the way, sometimes they lose that, especially when the founder leaves. Maybe professional management comes, but sometimes the founder's purpose is to maximize profit along with that purpose too. And I guess it depends. How big a psychopath they become as they grow.
Well, success does go to a lot of people's heads.
Exactly. Yeah, because power definitely corrupts at some point. So you got to figure out how to circulate that power. And maybe art museums are the right way. I don't know, but yeah, it's something that I've been thinking about. And I think the one thing that these trends that we've talked about is going to help is it's going to actually help empower more people, because people now will be able to own their own power physically with their solar systems and their batteries. And that's going to maybe I think the one thing about US culture that I like is people here don't put the government above them, whereas they think they're at the same level as the government. And in many older cultures and older countries in the world, there's still this culture or habit of thinking, okay, the government is going to provide X.
I think that's changing pretty rapidly. I think people are becoming disillusioned with government on a global level.
Exactly.
So do you want to talk through what are the interesting startups and that are doing things in solar?
Having been in the industry for a decade, I just kind of wanted to share some of the cool startups that I know of, and also some investors that that have been in my periphery. Some of them I know well, some of them not so much. But there's all sorts of really cool small to medium size, and some of them have raised big Series A or B even type companies that are very promising. And this space of solar and storage, I think, is going to resemble more real estate in some ways. It's going to be highly fragmented. Construction real estate space, I mean, if you think about it, it's not there's no major winner take most type companies in those industries. And I think solar and storage is going to resemble that in many ways. Yet there's going to be all sorts of cool and value adding creative digital platforms that make things more efficient. And so some of these companies are those companies. So
any one of those you want to highlight or mention?
I think they're
doing something really, really cool, or
okay, I want to be fair. So, back in 2011, 2012, when I first saw Khan Academy, or maybe it was 2009 and 10, that far. The Khan Academy gave me the inspiration for the idea of Solar Academy, which is essentially video-based content educating people at the time and place and medium that they want to get educated on. And one company that's doing that really well is HeatSpring. It's kind of like the Udemy of the solar space, focused on that. And I think there's a lot of need for that right now. And with Solar Academy, I plan to provide some content as well. But I see my role as more I'm also an investor. I'm a, you know, startup guy. Like I want to connect the dots rather than take over any one of these business models. So so HeatSpring is one that I really like. If I had, if they were interested, like that would be a good company to potentially invest and grow. Ohm Analytics is another one. It's run by a really brilliant finance guy who spent time with the major financiers in the solar space and kind of understood that the nature of these hundreds of different utility companies and the permitting process, like he connected many different dots to provide real-time analytics to mostly financiers, but other players like distributors too, on like what is going on in each market, because there are 10,000 active solar installers, and some of them are very big, some of them medium, some of them small. So, and nobody really, like the major financiers, for example, or the mostly the financiers, they want to target these installers as their channel partners, but they don't really know which one to target. So he's created a really cool information platform there. Collective Sun is a interesting company that I've been close with. They do nonprofit focused financing with a crowd financing model, for instance. And of course, these SaaS tools for design, sales, and operations, they've been around for a while. Helioscope, Aurora, Enact, these are really interesting companies.
So I have a question from a member of the audience. So Philippe is asking, do you plan to investigate dynamic agrivoltaicism? It's a great way to adapt agriculture to climate change while delivering solar electricity on top of the crops. See Sun Agri, for instance, in France. Do you know what he's talking about or no?
I don't. Sounds like an interesting concept, though. But I don't.
So some people were saying that if fusion ever happens, solar becomes irrelevant. I think you disagree with that statement. It'd be good to hear what you think of that.
Well, my disagreement to that comes from one. Again, that's too much power concentrated in the hands of too few to be really dangerous, first of all. And second, kind of like nuclear power in a way. And second, it's that God parity concept that Tony Seba talks about, which is that, even if you could produce, he says, if you could produce electricity for free with nuclear or fusion in a central power plant, the cost of distributing that over the grid and the cost of maintaining that grid is still 6 cents of that 13 cents that we're paying here in the U.S. And it's
I guess the conclusion is at some point, solar plus batteries, panels plus batteries is cheaper than the cost of maintaining the grid. So even if you have fusion, because the cost of maintaining the grid is 6 cents 6 cents kilowatt hour, the solar would still have a massive role to play. Okay, that actually makes sense. But probably for the foreseeable future, there's going to be a hybrid. The grid is going to be the primary provider of electricity. You're going to layer this on top, and at some point it switches. So I think we probably have a grid for the next 20, 30 years.
I think it was Elon Musk that I heard. He said it's either going to be 80-20 or 20-80 solar and nuclear or fusion, something like that. And we do need a baseline, and we do need the grid, I think, here in the Western world. Africa might be a different story, like it was with mobile phones versus landline phones. Like they totally skipped landline phones. They might not have.
Well, the problem is if you're in a city, right? Like I'm in New York right now in a massive tower. I can't. There's no place for me to put like solar panels or batteries or whatever. Like I don't see how I can get power outside of the grid.
So for that, I have this suggested actions thing, and of course, if you're in New York, you probably are not going to put a little bit of solar on top of your high-rise there. But you can still get energy conscious and understand your daily and annual kilowatt-hour consumption. Most homes consume about 30 kilowatt-hours of electricity a day, which is about half the battery tank of a Model 3 Tesla. which so like a Model 3 Tesla can power an entire home, entire average U.S. home for 2 days. So like it would be helpful to understand that and what that is, and then what size of a solar system would you need to cover all that consumption, like for the whole year, and then understand the net metering rules between in your utility district, and then get some proposals and understand how the process works and what the costs are and so forth. And if you're living in a rental or multi-unit building like you are, there could be community solar deals in your area where there are these large solar farms that are produced, and they do deals with utility companies, and then those are extended to the homeowners. They can subscribe to that, and of course you can ask your local utility company to advance the net metering and solar plus storage policies faster than they are doing it.
So if I was to summarize all this, it's solar is cheap and becoming cheaper, including both with and without batteries. Probably will be the main form of energy production at some point in the next decade, which is extraordinary in the fight for climate change. If you own a detached house, and it's your own house, and you're not an apartment, you should already look into adding a solar system immediately. If you're in an apartment building, probably a little bit harder, but you can look into community solar options. That's it. Anything else? Any final thoughts or anything we didn't cover we should talk about?
If you're an entrepreneur, sensing that this might be an area for you, do your first solar installation. Get an electrician friend or a contractor friend, or local, and do your first installation, because that's how Civic Solar started. My co-founder there at Civic Solar, he putting a solar on his home, we saw all the issues with the distribution space, and that was our aha moment to get into the business. And so if you're an entrepreneur, partner up with a local electrician or contractor and do your first installation and see where that takes you. Cool.
I think we have no more questions for the audience. So if that's it, that's great. Well, thank you for joining us, Karim. And it's great that it looks like solar and in a way it brings optimism in the fight against climate change, where people have seen or thought that it's really rather desperate. But it seems like we're making really good progress.
Thank you, Fabrice. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you, sir.